Welcome back. It is season 2. Segev.
We are going global. We are live.
No, well, we didn't say global yet. Although this first episode is somebody who's doing some really, really cool work in Ghana. Before we get into that, I'm happy to have joined me in the studio. You all might remember episode 3, episode 4, somewhere along the way.
Season 1, episode 3.
Season 1, we talked to a wonderful scholar named Magdalawit Derive. Magdalawit was walking by the lab and I said, come in the studio and let's do something. And here she is. You want to say hi?
Hi, Bryan. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me again.
I'm not going to interview you this time. And my second guest, I'll allow you to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alice Apostolakos. I was in... Which episode was it?
Well, no, that episode is to come. So that's
that's
a surprise.
Okay, surprise episode.
We're going to use that to introduce your badass podcast that's coming up soon. Just saying. They don't know about that yet, right?
Oh,
so
they don't know about
let them wonder.
Yeah.
Let them wonder.
Okay. Well, you'll see more of me later. But yeah, my name is Alice Apostolakos. I'm an undergraduate student here at FIU. I'm currently running my own podcast, which, we will learn more about. But yeah, super happy to be here.
One thing we like about Knowledge Unbound is that we're all about friends, right? And, it's not just about talking to people, hearing their story, having them help us understand the world better, but ways in which we can just have these exciting collaborations. So Alice is going to launch a podcast later this summer. You'll hear more about it on this podcast and on our social media channels. Magdalawit is a permanent friend of the program, for better or for worse. And today, on episode 1 of season 2, very excited. We talked to Dr. Heather Beem, who runs a nonprofit called the Practical Education Network. There's just a lot to learn about this, and I don't want to get into it too deeply, but I just encourage you as you listen to not just be wowed, I guess, by the particulars of what the nonprofit does, but the broader and bigger messages that she has in there for how we can be thinking about education. Segev, you're sure you're happy being on camera?
It is a very welcome change.
It's
I'll
a
tell you
welcome
that.
change. All right.
I wanted it.
Well, welcome everyone. Hope you enjoy the episode. See you at the end. So first I want to point out that we're actually recording this episode at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia. My friend, Dr. Stephanie Guzler, was kind enough to get us a reservation here. Heather, one of the things I want to do, I always never want to do on this podcast is tell somebody's story for them, right? And you've had such an interesting journey from grad school to the kinds of projects that you do now. For this part of the episode, at least, let's start from that point. Let's start from you at MIT. So tell us a little bit about what you were doing at MIT, and then what took you from MIT to the Practical Education Network.
I was studying mechanical engineering at MIT in the PhD program, and I was getting to work on really cool cutting-edge research in fluid mechanics and studying bio-inspired approaches to designing technologies, all very cool. But I also, in parallel to doing all that mechanical engineering research, I found myself really captivated by the larger atmosphere that I was in at MIT. Specifically, what people call the maker movement was very alive in the space that I was occupying there.
Had it started at that time? Had that movement started?
Yes. I would say it had started, yes.
So what is the maker movement?
The maker movement is a movement in which there's a desire to see people of all walks of life engage in creating, in building, bringing things to life, whether they're very functional or just very artistic or just fun. It's all kind of about getting people to be a part of that very rich process of creation and building. Right. And so that was very much alive and active at MIT, obviously with the focus on more engineering and functional things. But I just realized that I was surrounded by people who were always making stuff. You walk down the hallways and you see anything and everything you can think of, robots moving up and down or all kinds of gadgets. And that was really fun. So I got, involved in that. I started, tinkering around and building stuff as well. But I realized that in addition to, of course, the physical artifacts that were being created, it seemed to have an effect on myself and my peers that we gained this confidence that we could solve problems. It seemed to me that as we engaged in this act of making and creating things, it gave us this perception, this mindset that we can go out into the world and solve problems that are out there. It sort of felt like nothing is impossible. There are big challenges in the world, but we can solve them.
Sorry to interrupt, but was it sort of the creator aspect of it? The fact that you created this thing, I don't want to say it gave you a God complex, right? But at the same time, to create the thing, you had to be almost by definition a problem solver or a figure outer, right? Do you think it's what like the natural step from that mindset was to then look beyond the thing you created and say, okay, well, what else can I create? What else can I solve?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that process of bringing something to life led to the perception that more things can be created, more things can be solved.
Right. I guess one of the things I hear when you talk about this, and I'm asking these questions now because I want to know to what extent these values/virtues transferred into your next set of projects. There's a deep element of inclusiveness in it, I see, in that, instead of a education situation where you're just simply receiving information, even if it's good information, if you are in the process of creation, there is almost a very natural way you see yourself as part of what was created and part of the knowledge that was generated, which is a different relationship with knowledge than if I was just a receiver. Can you talk a little bit about that impact?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, related to the constructivist approach in education, which apparently also came from some folks at MIT a number of years ago. Yeah, definitely. I think there's very much an element of engagement that comes from that. As you are involved in creating something, you feel much more engaged, you feel more ownership over it, you feel much more connected to whatever you're interacting with compared to just receiving or downloading information from someone else.
Okay, so what was the next steps after that?
Yeah, so as I was kind of reflecting on that experience I was having, being in that environment where hands-on learning was very much celebrated, I started to just become curious. What would it take to help students in other parts of the world get to experience that as well? If that was an important or helpful part of the education I was receiving, how could we enable students, outside of the confines of MIT, which is a very small institution, get to experience that as well? And specifically, what would it take to make that available for students in a place where it seems particularly challenging to do a very hands-on experiential education, in a place where there seems to be less material availability in a school? Can students still have this as an outcome? Can students still emerge from their schooling experience having this confidence to solve problems and become even change makers in their own community? So all these ideas were kind of swelling up for me as a curiosity is what it started off as.
Yeah. I'm not satisfied yet. And I'll tell you why.
Okay.
It's not that I'm not satisfied. It's that there were many other students at MIT who had the experience of creation and being in a makerspace. Heather Beem was the student who turned that experience into, I wonder what is possible for others. So I guess the thing that I'm curious about, why you take that step mentally, right? I mean, you could have said, oh, this was cool and I can go on and be a great engineer and this has taught me a lot that I can now take to that Fortune 500 company, etc. You asked that question. So I'm curious as to, and I don't know, maybe you don't have an answer for this, right? But I'm curious as to as you reflect on that moment or those moments, what can you think about that made you think of that experience in that particular way? It's transferability.
I think there are a lot of different threads that led to that. One is the context in which I grew up. My dad was in the Peace Corps right after he finished college. And so growing up, we heard from him all the time about his experience in Nepal, how impactful it was on him. So definitely in the back of my mind, there's always been an interest or a desire to see what I could also experience if I had a similar cross-cultural experience like that. And then my mom is from Taiwan. So when we grew up, we would always, every few years, go to Taiwan. We even went to school there. And so there was already kind of a precedent for thinking to some extent about how education differs in different contexts based on my own experience in the US and then in Taiwan. So that's one thread. And then another was my faith, my Christian faith, I think has, built a deeper sense in me that there is a need, there's a sense of purpose that requires one to think beyond oneself and to sort of give and serve others. So that's another thread. Another thread I'll also share is that in the PhD program, you have to take the qualifying exams. And I
know.
that thing. So I took the qualifying exams and I failed the first time I failed. And I felt so, just distraught and all of this stuff. I was just wondering what am I doing? Am I on the right path? Because up until that point, academically, I'd been able to more or less achieve the things I had set out in front of myself. And at that moment, I sort of took it as a wake-up call. For me, there's a faith element embedded in that as well. There was a sense that God was saying, okay, Heather, take this as a wake-up call. Don't just live your life continuing on to try and just build up your academic experience, but think about you have the amazing opportunity. You're in a place where there's so many programs you could get involved in. There's so many things you could use as launching points to get engaged in doing something much bigger than yourself. And so I sort of took that moment in my graduate school experience as a wake-up call to also see what I could do to connect to a broader, ideally international perspective.
So before I ask you for details, give us an overall description of the Practical Education Network.
Practical Education Network, or PEN for short, is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to enable every African child to learn by doing. We see a future where when students go to school across the African continent, they're doing activities, they're doing experiments, they're doing projects. And in the process, they're cultivating critical thinking, problem solving, technical skills that will enable them to become the change makers and innovators to drive development of their communities forward.
So give us some examples of some of the projects that PEN does.
Well, the key project that we do at PEN is teacher training. We organize a training program for science and math teachers across the K-12 spectrum, and we take them through how they can use everyday materials to teach in a much more hands-on and practical way. The reality is that a typical average school in a place like Ghana, where I live, constantly struggles for having enough things for the kids, enough desks, enough textbooks, you name it. And so the idea of them getting a lab, especially in the public schools, is something that, we will have to wait a while for. And so we think that shouldn't preclude students from getting to have a very rich experiential education. So we leverage what's available. We leverage what's around teachers and schools and students. Everyday things like plastic bottles, balloons, flowers, kebab skewers, even local foods like banku and kenke. We use all those things, and we guide teachers to how they can repurpose those into very hands-on activities that they can teach in school.
So a lot of my listeners are people who themselves teach classrooms, also students as well. And I know you probably have several examples, but I would love to just hear one example of how you take simple materials and turn it into a high-quality scientific experience.
All right, I'll give you two examples. One is...
But I said one.
Okay.
I'm kidding.
All right.
Give me two.
One of my favorites is what we call the breathing model.
Okay.
So, typically when teachers are trying to teach about the different systems we have in the human body, they'll draw a diagram on the board and then they'll label everything and then tell the students to draw it and then memorize and then repeat after me. All these vocabulary, just memorize it. So instead of drawing the whole respiratory system, we tell teachers, why don't you take a water bottle, plastic water bottle, empty one, cut off the bottom, where that is now open, tie a plastic bag, and then in the mouth of the bottle, hang a balloon. Then you observe the balloon while you pull the plastic bag at the bottom. When you pull the plastic bag at the bottom, the balloon inflates. And then when you push the plastic bag in, the balloon deflates. So the balloon is representing your lung, and the plastic bag is representing your diaphragm. So you're going to see as the diaphragm expands and contracts, as you pull it in and out, the balloon, which is your lung, inflates and deflates. So this is a very visual and tactile way for students to get to see how the diaphragm plays a role in enabling us to breathe. Instead of just drawing it on the board, which is very dry and abstract, you get something that every student can touch and manipulate and get to have a much more dynamic experience engaging with that concept in.
Okay. What's the second one?
The second one is just a fun one to show how the local materials can actually be leveraged really cleverly. So in Ghana, there's a drink called sobolo. It's made from the hibiscus flower with ginger and a number of other spices. That flower naturally can change colors as it interacts with an acid or a base. So all teachers do, instead of needing to buy litmus paper, which is not that available, they can make their own litmus paper by crushing the hibiscus flower and boiling it and then dipping some paper in it. So you have your own litmus paper that changes colors using what's available in the environment.
Okay. So I'm assuming that you didn't just leave Cambridge, Massachusetts and show up in Accra. Hey, I'm here to do some science experiments. And by the way, start a nonprofit. So tell us, why Ghana? How did you, get there, and what was that transition like?
Yeah, I didn't just show up. It was a course of multiple years kind of going back and forth before deciding to move and launch the nonprofit. Through MIT, there's a program called D-Lab that takes students through courses on how they can engage with communities, usually rural communities, to work on engineering projects. They had been working with a school in Ghana a number of times. And so through those connections at D-Lab, Ghana just became kind of the easiest place for me and some other students to connect and say we wanted to come and try some projects out with the students. So when I was still in graduate school, I found myself at this school in Ghana, thanks to the D-Lab connections. I just had a few days there. My first trip to Ghana, I show up in this classroom. It's summer, it's really hot. The students have all gone. They're not in class, so they're all out on the street selling, to get their daily bread, basically. But then eventually the teacher rallied them in to see, hey, let's come do some projects because this person from MIT showed up. Let's see what the person has for us. And they eventually came in and, they actually looked a little disappointed when they saw that I didn't show up with equipment, I'm supposed to be coming with a bunch of... a bunch of stuff for them to use. But I said, let's try and use what we have available. Let's see what we can figure out. And, they were kind of disappointed when they heard that. But eventually there was one young boy who came forward with this plastic bucket. And everybody was kind of looking at him like, okay, what are we going to do with this? We're coming here to do engineering projects. But slowly over time, we figured out that we could actually take that bucket and make a wind turbine. So we took this plastic bucket, we cut it in half, and then each semicircular half kind of fits together and in such a way that it makes an S shape. And then as the wind blows, it turns the whole two pieces. And so we put that on a wooden pole. We got some wires and magnets from old computers. We put that at the base. And then as the bucket spun, the blades, we were able to generate a little bit of electricity from the setup, the whole setup. Yeah. Okay. Which was really useful because when I was there, the school didn't really have constant electricity. So that was my first experience in Ghana. And I was still a student, so I had to go back to MIT after those few days on the ground. But I just felt so captivated by that experience because I saw that with a little bit of exposure, these students were able to build something that was really meaningful for them.
Right.
They could at least charge their phone, from something that they had built themselves. So that was my first experience in Ghana. But then over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, I kept having conversations with people in Ghana on the phone. When I got the chance, I would go for short trips back and forth before finally in 2016, I decided to move to Ghana and set up, an organization to really do what we can to make hands-on education more available.
What went into that decision?
A lot of things. Yeah. If it was a straightforward decision, I would have made it more quickly. Yeah. So those phone call conversations after my first trip led to the idea that if we really wanted to make that thing that happened in that classroom where they built a wind turbine, if we want to make that available at a larger scale, we should engage teachers. That was what the conversations led to. And so my follow-on trips were all around teacher training teachers on how they could be the ones to now guide students to gather these items locally and make projects. And I was going back and forth. I would go to Ghana, I would raise money for my plane ticket, go to Ghana, run a training, and then I'd go back to Boston. And one thing that really stood out was when I was back in Boston, I would get messages from some of the teachers that had received training that they had gone on to train other people, which was impressive because at that time, nobody was getting paid. It was purely voluntary thing.
And when you trained those teachers, did you expect/ask them to train other teachers, or did they just voluntarily, they were so excited about it that hey, you should learn this too?
Well, we asked them. Yeah, we did say, we want you guys to go out and spread it. But we didn't give them any resources to do that. So it's more just like, we would really love it if you guys do this. So, most of them didn't, but a few did. And it was like, okay, wow, that's really cool. They, whatever it took for themselves to sacrifice to go out there, organize a program, provide lunch for people kind of thing. They were willing to do it because they felt that whatever was there to be shared was worth it. And so that was one thing that really stood out to me. At that point, I'd sort of been immersed around the development space for a few years, and I got to see that, it's not easy making things change, making things work. It's not easy. So if there's something like people actually on their own going out and spreading this thing, then there's actually something of value here. There, yeah. And so it's sort of, over time, I came to a point where I realized, okay, the least I can do is at least try, go on the ground and at least try for a period of time to see what could happen if, my full attention is on this.
So it was a commitment to give it a good faith effort.
Yeah.
And just see how it goes, basically. Okay. What was the response? Obviously they liked it because they went and they trained others. But like in the moment, while you're doing that training, what was the feedback from the teachers? And I want to be careful here because I don't want to poo-poo what was happening before you showed up, right? But in terms of their teaching pre and post pen training, right? What was the impact of the pen training on their teaching in the classroom?
Well, first I'll say that from the first training we did even till now, we pretty consistently get the kind of feedback from teachers that they really, really appreciate the training. They'll often use the word eye-opener because it's like they always wanted to do something much more hands-on and experiential, but they felt it wasn't possible in their classroom given the material constraints. And so we always hear things like, this was an eye-opener. I'm so grateful. This is really exciting for me. I think there's so much I can do now. So we have lots of stories of when we go and visit these teachers, they are engaging their students in activities where previously they were just relying on the blackboard. We show up to schools where teachers have their own science box. They've collected materials. They've gotten their students involved. So now they have like a repertoire of things that they're ready to deliver at any point in time. We have stories of teachers who would say things like, they're teaching in an area that's kind of a slum area. And one day the government decided they were going to knock down a bunch of the structures there that a lot of the kids were living in. And so now the kids have dispersed. They're really far away and they don't come to her school anymore. But once she started doing activities, you know, the few kids that were there told their friends and like, oh, there's something cool. There's something exciting happening at school. So now their students are actually attending school again, whereas before they weren't motivated to.
Yeah. Any collaborations with the Ministry of Education? I'm not sure what it's called, but I'm assuming there's a state level organization. Has there been any partnership conversations with them?
Yes. We always work with the Ministry of Education, or in Ghana, the Ghana Education Service. Anytime we're interacting with the public schools, we work with their district science coordinator, and then usually up the chain, all the way up to the national level as well.
Okay. I'm assuming the reception's been good, but also, you know, I know Ghana is a big country, spatially speaking. And how far has your reach been? Have you been able to go up to the Volta region, Kumasi, even Burkina Faso?
Yeah.
I guess it's just northeast.
Yeah, we have done at least some of our training in about 10 of the 16 regions of Ghana. So we've covered a majority of the regions. We're based in Accra, which is on the very south. So a lot of activity has been in the greater Accra region. But yes, we've worked in the Volta region, Central region, Ashanti region, even the northern region a little bit as well.
Okay. I want to shift gears just a little bit. I think you said you made a decision to stay in 2016. I think it was January 2017. I had the privilege of taking some students to Ghana on a study abroad trip. We did 2 weeks. And we spent a week in Cape Coast. We spent a week in Kumasi. And while we were at Cape Coast, being able to go to one of the slave castles was and still is perhaps one of the most moving experiences of my entire life. Right? And I recognize the privilege of being able to have had that experience in person. And maybe it's because we're so many centuries removed, you know, obviously there's reasons to remember why the transatlantic slave existed. But I guess there are several questions here. I'm not quite sure which one to ask first. I mean, first, I'm interested in your own engagement with Ghana and its history and its relationship with the West. And I'm also interested in you, physically identifying very different to the people that you serve and you work with, and how that relationship has evolved over time. So I guess I'll let you start with either one. But, you know, moving from, you know, I think you say you're born and raised in Oklahoma, you spent some time in Taiwan, you in Cambridge, right? But, you know, and Ghana is a very different context to all of that, right?
Yes.
I don't know if you've learned Tree yet, you know, all of that, you know, so maybe tell me, I'm asking in general about your integration into Ghanaian culture and life.
Yes, before I moved there, I had, let's say, no connection to Ghana before I got involved in the MIT D-Lab program. So yeah, it's been, everything has been different, you know, in life and everything there. One thing that I'm really grateful for is I was welcomed by a host family for about a year when I first moved there. They were just so generous to welcome me with open arms, even though I didn't know them. Just the mom is a principal in one of the school districts that I was working more in. And so, yeah, thanks to them, I got to understand culture, family dynamics, food, language. I speak some Tree, So, yeah, I have a lot to be grateful to that host family for. And so, yeah, in Ghana, when I tell people there, I've been there for 8 years, they're like, oh, okay, so then you're Ghanaian then pretty much. That's a common thing people say to me. I wish my Tree was better. I'd feel more comfortable saying yes in response, but it's okay, at least the basics. Yeah, I certainly feel that tension or that dynamic of being a foreigner. I feel that not from Ghanaians, but I just, you know, I'm just aware of myself, my own presence, if I can say it that way. I am constantly aware of that. And I know that, ideally, everything we do should be locally led as much as possible. And so I hope we'll get to that point. Hopefully my role is mainly to kind of spark some ideas, spark some, attention, bring some attention to something that could be done a different way, which I think that is one thing that a foreigner can do, is kind of, captivate attention to a topic, at least for a period of time. So hopefully my presence is enabling that. But certainly I hope that whatever we do is embedded in what is really of interest locally. And so, but it's definitely a constant thing I'm aware of, and trying to make sure I'm, thinking carefully on what role I play.
Yeah. Have you been able to go to the slave castle?
Yes, I have. I went the first time I was in Ghana, and it was very moving. In fact, I haven't gone back because it was a very emotional experience. So, yeah.
How has your time there impacted your feeling when you come back to the U.S.? And I don't mean that in any particular direction, right? I'm just thinking of that context and your role there, and coming back to here, and I know you're still somewhat tied to how we think about education in the U.S. and in higher education, and it's the kinds of questions that people like myself and others are trying to tackle. What about your experience has taught you about education, its value, how it's implemented, that perhaps we can learn from as we tackle questions back here?
Well, what I would love to see in the future, and I think we're getting there, is what I would love to see is that STEM teachers in Africa are actually seen as exemplars of hands-on teaching, because they need to be resourceful to teach effectively. I would like to see that becomes a trend, that instead of knowledge or ideas seemingly having to be imported from somewhere into Africa, we can actually export some of these things. And I think that's possible, especially with Africa's growing population. I hope that people will start to see that what's happening with STEM teaching in Africa is actually something that could be inspiration or something to learn from in other contexts. And I think it fits, in the US, I know there's a lot of interest in much more culturally relevant pedagogy. And so I hope that there's a link there, that what's happening in Africa can be looked to for some of that inspiration.
Have you been able to tell your story back here, besides this podcast?
That's an interesting question. Not to some extent. Yeah, to some extent. But it would be good to do more of that.
Well, the reason why I ask is because, I unfortunately know of so many kind of parachute type, volunteerism, right? Where it, with all due respect to those who do it, it ends up coming across more as I'm kind of here to save you, versus, find ways to tap into an existing beautiful intellectual resource that you already have, right? Which is a much more equity-minded thing. And I guess I'm enamored by your model. And, maybe this is just the researcher writer in me, right? Would like to see this more known.
Okay.
So I know you've expanded into some other countries. Tell us about that.
Yes, we have piloted in Rwanda and Liberia.
Okay.
And both went really well. Very similar response from teachers, like, we didn't know there was so much we could do with what's available around us. We need more of this training. This training should be spread across the country. Same kind of feedback we've been hearing in Ghana. And I'm excited to say that in Liberia, it looks like, fingers crossed, we will be able to start expanding to all of the 15 counties in Liberia, hopefully starting from next year. So yeah, we've had a fantastic time working with the Ministry of Education in Liberia, and looking forward to seeing this take root over there.
Okay. Okay, very nice. So I wish you the best with that. Let's go back to MIT for a second. So you failed your quals.
Mm-hmm.
But you had started to go to Ghana before you finished your degree.
Mm-hmm.
So if my math is correct, then there was a period of time between when you eventually passed your quals and the end of your degree where you were sort of back and forth to Ghana,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you were essentially finishing up your MIT degree while kind of almost having this second existence with Ghana.
Yes.
And I guess I'm wondering, because you talked about how faith played a role in that, when that moment happened, and asking yourself, I mean, what I took from it, it puts you in a space where you had to ask yourself what your why was, right? What your sort of purpose of engaging in this journey was.
Mm-hmm.
And so beyond that question, beyond asking yourself that question, how did the partnership with Ghana and the things you were doing there, how was that last segment of your doctoral process different than, say, when you started?
How was my experience
At
different?
MIT, right?
Okay.
So because now you're still at school, you're still in Cambridge, but you're sort of back and forth. And I guess what I'm gathering from you is that you are now at MIT with a different sense of purpose than you were perhaps when you
Yeah.
started. What was that change like?
Yeah, I definitely felt. Yeah, I think I could say I felt more purpose driven. Yeah, it felt like there was something very meaningful to put my energy into. Yeah.
Do you have colleagues who were doing that back and forth as well?
There were a couple other students that I was working with in those initial days, other MIT students. Yeah, but they weren't in the same lab or the same program as me.
Mm-hmm.
So not directly around me, which is, I think, why I found myself so drawn to the D-Lab program. So that was totally outside of my research lab, but it was filled with people who were engaging with communities internationally. So I really resonated with what was happening there, and I started spending more time there, getting involved with more student teams there.
Was there any pushback on you for making that choice?
No. Interestingly, I mean, thankfully, I had a PhD advisor who was very open, very, very hands off. So, as long as you are making progress, he was fine with it.
Give me my stuff. You do what you do.
Yeah.
Right? Well, no, I mean, I asked because in STEM, and not to stereotype all of STEM, right? But there's sometimes a very much like your job here is to help us publish, to do X, Y, and Z. These are the very requirements of the program. And, a lot of times programs don't necessarily make space when you have an expanded sense of why. So other people like yourself who have met around the country, when they've had that moment or are trying to think outside the box or operate outside the box, right? They're met with heavy resistance. Not necessarily because people don't like what they're doing, but they're uncomfortable, right? With the different way of looking at the role of academia. But I'm glad, I guess, you didn't really have that experience.
Yeah, I would say, thankfully during the school period, probably because my supervisor was quite hands-off, it was okay. But I would say the pushback really came when I decided to move, because that was the point at which everybody was like, are you sure? What are you really going to be doing there? Are you wasting your time? You just finished this degree, which you have some momentum behind, the work you were doing and all that. So that was really where the pushback came more. I mean, I think during school, the PhD is a long program, it's kind of, I guess people are kind of okay with you trying things here and there. But then when it came to the point of being like, okay, but no, really, this is what I'm actually going to pursue and put all my energy into, that's where I think there was more pushback.
What was your response?
I think my stubbornness has carried me a long way in this journey. I just felt so convicted at that point that this was the right thing for me to do, the right place for me to go, that I just sort of ignored a lot of the pushback that came.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me I'm not going to challenge you, but I'm going to ask because, Brian, how do I want to ask this? Because I hear in you in a much, I'm going to say my experience in a much less high stakes way, I guess, right? So I think I could think back to many points in my career where I made decisions that ran counter to what was expected of a grad student or a professor, right? And maybe I am a little stubborn too, but also I think thankfully most of those decisions worked out. But when I look back, what kind of carried me through is those decisions were guided by a very deeply rooted value system, right? In that, like, I knew why I was doing it. It wasn't just it looked cool and I just like to try a bunch of things. It's like, no, my parents told me, growing up, I'm a preacher's kid, so it kind of had a similar environment. And I think, the advice was you make decisions, whether it's your partner, whether it's your career, whatever, you make it guided by your values. So I wonder, as I'm hearing you say this, I'm wondering how much of it was just conviction and how much of it was you found you were able to re-tap into your value system. And once you did that, it became a father forgive them for they know not what they do kind of situation. Like like they don't understand why the why behind why you're being driven, right? And so you say, okay, I see why you think it's a bad idea, but I'm responding to something different that you don't understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I felt a deep sense of calling. I felt that there's a need and my skills, the opportunities I've been exposed to align with, like the overlap is too significant between the need and then what I can share from my own experience and what the feedback on the ground is. Like the overlap is too significant for me to not see it as this is what I'm being called into. And I felt that for me, it was a step of faith. And a lot of the pushback I was hearing felt like it was coming from a place of fear. And I felt I'm not going to make a decision about my life based on other people's fears. I'm going to do this out of faith. That seems more fruitful.
Okay. So, I mean, it's all well and good to talk about this now, 8 years later. The nonprofit is going great. I'm thinking about the undergraduates that I teach.
Okay.
Right? I'm even thinking about the grad students that I have the pleasure of mentoring, and some of whom have expressed strong desires to do good in the world, to really impact humanity in a profound way at some point in their life. But very often at 20 or at 25, like you can't even begin to think about what that looks like, right? If you are granted the opportunity to speak to students, which I'm sure you probably have from time to time, and they are facing up that kind of question, right? Like I would love to do something like what you're doing. Now, maybe not necessarily run a nonprofit, and who knows where my why will take me. But I don't quite know, like, what is sort of the first thing, right? Because somebody might say, well, it's great what you're doing, Heather, but, MIT had a D lab. And, maybe if you didn't have a D lab, you would have done something else, but they had a D lab. And that D lab got you this exposure, which then sort of generated this idea. If you had sort of specific things to say to students who are of that mindset, what would you tell them?
I would say be proactive, be proactive and explore to find the thing that really resonates with you, which might take time.
Yeah.
It might take a lot of time and, false starts and figuring things out. But I think be proactive. Don't wait. If you know that you have a desire to go out there and make an impact, don't wait for the opportunity to come to you. Be proactive and look for where you can fit in. And then be prepared for the pushback. Yeah, because most likely people are going to say that it doesn't make sense. If it doesn't fit in a nice box, then there's probably going to be pushback. So be prepared for that. But be ready to move with your conviction. If you do feel convicted, be ready to move through that pushback.
Yeah. What if the follow-up question, I'm thinking of your audience right now, Heather, right? I'm thinking of you in that auditorium and you give that great response and then somebody else raises their hand and said, but Dr. Beem, how do I know what my conviction is? How do I find that out?
Yeah, I think that can take, well, maybe for me, it took some time. It took some time to figure that out. That's why I would say be proactive and explore. because, you know, a lot of us have multiple interests, but then finding where our interests align with where an actual need is, that will take some time. So I think it requires being proactive.
It almost sounds like there's a little bit of serendipity. Right? So in exploring, you get exposed to these different experiences, and perhaps one of those experiences, one that you may not even think might impact you the way it will, impacts you in a particular way that gets that light bulb on, right? You know, I honestly never thought I would like teaching. In fact, I had probably convinced myself that I didn't like it because I was told early on in grad school, at least, that teaching was a waste of time. But when I finally got the chance to do it, I mean, it was a whole other level, right? And I don't know if there's a formula for that other than be open to new experiences.
Yeah, that's true.
Do you get pushback now?
Yeah, from my parents. Yeah, my parents really, really want me to be back in the U.S.
When are you gonna get a real job again?
Yeah, mainly from them. But we'll see. We'll see how everything plays out in the future. It still feels like there's a lot of momentum behind what we're doing. There's a lot of opportunity for growth and expansion. I'm very excited about seeing this work expand to multiple countries. So,
when you dream, what do your dreams look like in terms of pen? So what is sort of the perfect version of pen that you've daydreamed about?
I would love for us to have a presence, like country offices across the continent, at least in each of the key regions: West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa. And just seeing this diffusion happening, the diffusion of hands-on approaches happening, you know, organically, but at a large scale across the continent. That's what I look forward to seeing.
Okay. What kind of staffing do you have now, and what would it look like for that dream to happen?
Yeah, that dream will require much more staff than we currently do. We have a small team, but small but mighty. We have about 8 full-time staff in Ghana and then a handful of part-time folks. So about a dozen folks in the office there. And hopefully by this time next year, we'll have a handful of folks in Liberia on staff too.
Okay.
But yeah, we'll need equivalent, you know, at least 5-6 people in each of those country offices moving forward.
Okay. Let me ask about the experiments themselves. Or what do you call them?
We call them activities.
Activities.
Usually.
All right, let's say activities. That's probably more accurate. I think it's great. I think they're great. I remember I watched a couple of videos on your website of examples of stuff that you have done. But I also wanted to align here because I don't want a perpetual assumption that these countries will always be resource poor and will thus require, a basic materials type of experience to learn science. Now, at the same time, I also don't necessarily think that you need to have $5,000 machines to learn science. So when I hear you describe some of the things that as activities, I think less of that the area, the region, the school, the country is resource poor. I actually think more of these are really fundamental skills that I want a critically minded citizen to have. And a school anywhere, Ghana or anywhere else, does not need to spend $5,000 a student to teach those skills. And so I guess I'm wondering how do you navigate? So the reality is that a lot of the areas you work with are resource poor, and so there's a need for what you're doing and an appreciation for what you're doing. But at the same time, I'm sure you and certainly me don't want people just assuming that once they hear the A word, once they hear Africa, they then assume resource poor. Like, how do you handle that tug of war?
Yeah, and that's interesting because, I've heard a number of ministers and assistant ministers speak on various platforms from African countries, and they get very excited about talking about infrastructure. I mean, perhaps that's true for political figures everywhere, I suppose. But
you've been to Chicago.
Okay. Yeah, so that's the way. I mean, yes, infrastructure is going to improve over time because that's a lot of where government is putting their attention. So yes, even where school doesn't seem to have much now, we hope that in the future that won't be their story. So yeah, perhaps it's a branding thing that we have to refine. But I think, the underlying thing that we're really interested in is the hands-on piece. And so what we want to see is a shift from very theoretical, abstract teaching to a very hands-on experiential teaching. That's fundamentally what we're interested in. The materials is just whatever you have available, let's work with that. If you don't have anything, we'll work with what's available in the found environment. If you have a lab, great. But let's still make sure that you're using the lab in a very hands-on way.
Yeah. Okay. Because you know what, as you know, I teach intro bio. Well, that's one of the classes that I teach. But one of the labs that I taught when I was a grad student, my favorite lab is like the cheapest lab ever. It's yeast and a sugar sauce and a test tube and a beaker, right? And I guess you have a better test tube and the beaker, but you're able to ferment the sugar and measure alcohol production rates, right?
Okay.
And it was a very powerful exercise. It cost like $8, right? And yeah, so I mean, it's possible, right? And I guess I just want to communicate that just even if you educate in a U.S. context doesn't necessarily mean you have to run down the most expensive things, right?
Yeah, and I think when you use the local materials, there's also, there's another level of engagement because students don't, it's not like the long name of chemical that they're working with. They're like, okay, this is something that I recognize from my daily life. So then there's an ability to see that science is real. It's connected to their life if they're using things that they recognize, like yeast or whatever.
Okay. I'm going to stay there forever. You've gotten that question.
Oh, yeah, from my mom all the time.
And I know you probably don't even know the answer to it.
Perhaps not forever, because like we were talking about earlier, I think ideally whatever we're doing should be locally led and driven as much as possible.
Right.
So I don't know if my rule will need to be the same in perpetuity.
Right.
But for now, it's definitely home base for now. And like I said, I'm excited about seeing our work expand to other countries. So I envision for now I'll be in Ghana, but perhaps hopping around a little bit to get things started elsewhere.
All right, I'll let you out of here on this one. And this is a very, very, very important question. So I'm assuming that since you're now based in Accra, that you've had the pleasure of traveling a little bit throughout that region. I don't know, Ivory Coast, Senegal, Gambia, Nigeria. Am I correct?
A few places, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to get you in real trouble.
Oh my
with this
gosh,
one.
oh no.
Which one makes the best jollof rice?
Well, I can't. There's no way I can go against Ghana.
You can be truthful here. You don't have to protect yourself. I'm sure if it was somebody else, the Ghanaians will forgive you. I used to do this every year. So I taught at University of Rhode Island for 7 years. And there's a lot of West Africans who migrated to Rhode Island over time. And every year for my class, I would just stand in front and say, which of you makes the best jollof rice?
Gosh.
And they would be pandemonium.
I can imagine. Oh my goodness.
I only had the Ghanaian version. I had a friend in Rhode Island from Liberia, and his was really good too. But so real wars were fought over that question. And
Ghana. I have to stick with Ghana.
Yeah, stick with Ghana. Hey, Heather, thanks for spending some time with us.
My pleasure. Enjoyed
Best
it.
of luck with them.
Thank you.
Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. We are graciously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett impeccable Mr. Segev Amasai.
Always a pleasure.
Special thanks to our guest, Dr. Heather Beem, for sharing her story with us. Special thanks to our studio guests who graciously lent us, I don't know, maybe 20 seconds of their time. Alice?
You're very welcome.
I'm very welcome. Today, Heather talked to us about not necessarily waiting for big, high money investments to transform education, about being comfortable with what you have where you are and making that transformative. I just want maybe a quick word from both of you about an experience that you may have had where you just had to make do. You had to make something happen and you found a way to do that. Magdi, you want to start?
I think that's the entirety of life, no?
Yeah.
I come from a developing country where money is always an issue. And if I had more money, I'd do this. I'd apply there. But you just have to make do with what you have and make sure you're just ready for whatever opportunity presents itself. So I think that's a broader lesson in life, particularly for people who come from financially constrained background, let me say. Yeah,
not just for education, Alice.
for sure.
She had such a good answer. I'd say about the same. I'm a first-gen immigrant too. I come from a developing country as well, Bulgaria. So I feel like a lot of my life, like growing up, being the first in my family to go to college here, and I got into bunch of colleges that I wanted to go to, but I could only afford to go here. We talked about that further in my episode, which
it's coming soon.
It's coming soon.
Yeah.
I think also like mentally and emotionally, like accepting what you have and not living in like the expectations of what you want to have, of like, I need to have this and I need to have that in order to be happy, but like being happy with what you have now and like seeing the beauty in the now, I think.
And it was I don't want to say it was a tough episode because I really enjoyed it, but I think I was navigating a tension throughout where I applaud the theme of equanimity. I applaud the theme of being in a space of contentment and making do and making something positive and meaningful happen. But I also wish for a world where those brilliant, wonderful students can be open to much more possibilities should, if those of us from the outside can see what they can accomplish given what was available, oh my God, what more could happen? Should we take the time to just add 2% more, right?
Yeah.
And my hope, my friends, is that this is a lesson you take from today, right? That whatever classroom you're in, whatever city you're in, whatever country you're in, whatever subject matter that you're asked to teach, you have beauty in front of you, and it's just up to us to make the most of that. See you next week. And as always, be excellent to each other.
We see a future where when students go to school across the African continent, they're doing activities, they're doing experiments, they're doing projects. And in the process, they're cultivating critical thinking, problem solving, technical skills that will enable them to become the change makers and innovators to drive development of their communities forward. What I would love to see in the future, and I think we're getting there, is what I would love to see is that STEM teachers in Africa are actually seen as exemplars of hands-on teaching. Because they need to be resourceful to teach effectively, I would like to see that becomes a trend, that instead of, knowledge or ideas seemingly having to be imported from somewhere into Africa, we can actually export some of these things.
Let you know that you'll find peace.